Hi everyone, it's me again, Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross, and today I'm going to be talking about how historical trauma impacts African Americans. So, historical trauma refers to the lasting emotional and psychological harm caused by a massive group experience of violence and oppression or dispossession. Now, this trauma is passed down through generations, as we've been talking about, even if descendants themselves have never directly experienced slavery or have never been enslaved. Here are some key points about historical trauma. First of all, it has to be a collective experience. It stems from a large-scale event or events that affect an entire community. So the example of slavery is pertinent, but could also be genocide, war, or forced migration, etc. There is intergenerational transmission. The trauma is not just an individual experience. It gets passed down through families and communities across different generations. And then there are long-term effects. The psychological and emotional harm can manifest in future generations through issues such as low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and even physical health problems like heart disease and diabetes, which are higher in the Black population. Social and cultural impact is that historical trauma can also have a bigger impact on a community's social fabric, their cultural identity, and a sense of trust. Some examples of historical trauma besides slavery include the Holocaust and its ongoing impact on Jewish communities, the legacy of slavery, as we've been talking about, and ongoing racialized trauma for African Americans, and the forced relocation and cultural destruction of Native peoples, indigenous peoples across the world. So it's important to understand historical trauma is crucial for addressing issues of intergenerational trauma. It's also crucial for addressing issues of social justice, mental health, and racial healing. Only by acknowledging the past and its lingering effects can communities begin to heal and move forward. So here's a breakdown of some of the key points and how they connect to the current generation, many of whom are not sure that they connect. So first of all, intergenerational trauma is a burden that's passed down, and the core concept is that the psychological inheritance passes from ancestors who experienced a traumatic or terrifying event. Dr. Joy DeGruy, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, Leary's concept is, and her book is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And that book highlights how the trauma of slavery wasn't a one-time event. It was a legacy carried through generations. Now, this trauma manifests in several ways. And this is what she talks about in her book, The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. First of all, self-esteem and identity. The Clark doll studies from the 1940s tragically showed Black children favoring white dolls. And this reflects internalized negative stereotypes and a struggle with self-worth. Leary terms this vacant self-esteem, a consequence of being systematically devalued. So I'm going to just show you a short clip of the video showing the doll study so that you can see for you.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll?
They also have done, extensive research based on this doll study and pointed out some of the other things that people are experiencing. One is learned helplessness. Witnessing stories of past racism and encountering ongoing racial threats in media creates a sense of powerlessness. This is what we call learned helplessness. And learned helplessness discourages attempts to improve one's situation or one's lot in life. There are also so many health outcomes that demonstrate the weight of racism, or what's called racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue describes the chronic stress that Black people experience due to everyday racism. This stress can lead to, for example, accelerated aging. There have been research studies that show that chronic stress can lead to biological aging, which is a risk factor for many, many health problems. It can also lead to high blood pressure. We know that racism is linked to higher stress levels, which can increase the risk for hypertension or high blood pressure, a condition that's more prevalent in Black communities. It also can be associated with mental health issues, as we've talked about in the past. Discrimination is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders, particularly among young Black adults. So how do we break the cycle? How do we heal from this historical trauma? Obviously, it's not a quick and dirty solution. I can't give you tips and tricks on how to heal historical trauma. But it is important to understand the post-traumatic slave syndrome. Intergenerational trauma sheds even greater light on how these historical events, like slavery, continue to impact African Americans today. So the key ways that happens is post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic slave syndrome. The book that I just mentioned by Dr. DeGruy, her theory describes the specific ways that slavery's trauma continues to manifest in Black Americans' behavior and other patterns. We mentioned the vacant esteem, low self-worth, hopelessness, and depression, marked propensity for anger and violence, so an increased suspiciousness and lack of trust, potential for violence, racist socialization, so that there's internalized racism and negative views of oneself and of one's own culture by Black people. So Black people internalizing those views. So I want to play a video for you by Dr. DeGruy, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that in the video.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, and then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course. There's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
In the video, she showed an example of one of the ways that this transfers across generations, and that's the loving denigration. As seen in the video, her example of enslaved mothers downplaying their children's strength as a protective strategy. And that highlights how trauma can be passed down. It becomes part of how we parent our children to protect them. I think she explained it very well in the video. So just to get a sense of some of the stuff we've been talking about today, I would ask you to do this little exercise with me. And the question, and this is from Beverly Daniels Tatum, and she calls it racialized first memory. So just think of the first racialized memory you had and ask yourself how old you were. The first time you even understood that there was something called race or that you were different than other people. And then the next question is, who did you tell, if anyone? Or did you tell anyone? And if so, what was their response? So this little exercise points out a couple of things. One is most people will tell you that they were quite young when they had their first racialized experience. They may have been 4 or 5 or even a little bit older, but they were still children. And so that tells you how pervasive racism is in this country. The second thing is that many children knew instinctively not to talk about that experience, and they didn't tell anyone. And so that shows you that that sense racism is a taboo subject is pretty prevalent. And sometimes children did tell a parent or caregiver, and they may have received very helpful answers, or they may have been inculcated with white supremacist kind of talk. So it gives you a sense of where you may be coming from in relationship to people of color in the United States based on your own past. So it's something to reflect on. Again, I always advise that you take the opportunity to talk about this with your friends, family members, whoever you feel safe with, to journal about it, and to think about how that initial experience with race is influencing you today. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.